They say there's nothing that tests your patience quite like a cantankerous homeowners association. Believe me, I learned that the hard way the morning I opened my front door and nearly tripped over a mountain of rotting trash that had mysteriously appeared on my lawn. It wasn't just a small scattering of garbage, but a staggeringly tall, reeking heap that looked suspiciously like the HOA's community cleanup had targeted exactly one address, mine. I've been living in the Oakbridge development for almost a decade, and while I never exactly fell in love with the meticulously curated flower beds or the cookie-cutter houses, I tolerated it. You had to, if you wanted a quiet suburban life with guaranteed property values. Or so I told myself whenever the monthly newsletter with 12 pages of new regulations arrived in my mailbox, courtesy of the draconian HOA board. To be honest, I'd never been on their good side. My grass grew a little too wild for their liking, to a thrilling height of 3 inches instead of 2¼ One of my shutters was painted a half shade darker than the rest, and God forbid I installed a small wind chime in my backyard without written permission. Yes, they sent me a warning letter about a wind chime. I tolerated these petty slaps on the wrist because I had more important concerns: my job at the local biotech lab, my son's medical bills, my mother's fragile health. The last thing I needed was a time-consuming spat over whether my ivy trellis conformed to the uniform look of the neighborhood. But the day I discovered that mountain of trash festering by my mailbox was the day I snapped. It wasn't random. Oh no, I'm positive it had been carefully orchestrated by the HOA. A subtle message: we control what's trash in this neighborhood, and you're going to learn it if you don't fall in line. Because here's the deal. Our HOA had a twisted sense of justice, courtesy of a man named Leonard Len Tupper. He'd retired at 50 after he allegedly made a killing on real estate flips-up in Seattle. He had built a personal nest egg large enough that he could effectively lord over Oakbridge with the unstoppable fervor of a power-hungry dog catcher. Rumor had it he'd personally spearheaded new rules requiring community uniformity. He took it so seriously that last year he fined a newly arrived family for planting hydrangeas. Hydrangeas of all things. At times, the man seemed to be searching for a spark of rebellion, just so he could squash it. I never came to Len's meetings. That much was probably the original sin in his eyes. He'd urged me multiple times. "We'd love your input on community matters," he'd say in that condescending half-smirk. I'd politely decline, explaining I had to work late or attend to personal obligations. After a few months, the forced politeness gave way to thinly veiled threats and citations. My offenses included a driveway crack that apparently destroyed the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood and a grill left out in the open. I paid the minimal fines, hoping it would buy me peace. It did not. So how did the trash end up on my lawn? It was probably the ultimate demonstration of HOA muscle. I'd last heard they had commissioned a community cleanup team, ordering each homeowner to place bag garbage at the curb by 7 p.m. on Sunday night for a specialized Monday pickup. Because I'd worked all weekend and missed the volunteer memo, my lack of involvement was singled out as a willful refusal to pitch in. In classic Oakbridge style, they repurposed my portion of the collected trash as a humiliating display. Their rationale was something like, "If you won't help keep our neighborhood pristine, enjoy your personal pile." They even had the gall to post pictures of it on the local message board, captioned, "Neighbors, help the community by reminding those who ignore our cleanup efforts. Let's keep Oakbridge beautiful together." I tried calling the HOA office, but they directed me to file a formal complaint in writing. I left one voicemail for Len Tupper, but he never called back. It was a Wednesday, and my entire yard smelled like a dumpster in the July heat. I was absolutely seething, enough that my normally passive spirit started conjuring payback fantasies. I considered emailing the local newspaper or posting a humiliating video about the HOA on social media, but that felt too small. My frustration needed an outlet that would match the HOA's brand of petty sabotage. That's when I first thought, what if I delivered something right back to them? The mental image burst into my mind so vividly that I started to laugh at my own brilliance. Garbage was vile, sure, but there was something even more pungent that could repay the favor in spectacular fashion. Manure. I spent that entire night trying to sleep, but kept twitching awake from a mix of rage and exhilaration. The idea was so outlandish, I almost dismissed it as a joke. But every time I recalled how the HOA had singled me out, how they wanted to make me the scapegoat for not volunteering for their mandatory chores, the indignation came roaring back. The next day, I tiptoed out to the pile of garbage, still spread out from the previous day's rummaging raccoons. I put on a respirator mask, gloves, and started shoveling what I could into black trash bags. There was no way I could work in that stench without some basic protection. I nearly retched every few seconds, trying not to picture the filth that was soaking into my lawn. It took 2 hours before I could see the grass again. My fiancée, Jules, who lived across town but visited me often, offered to help. But I refused. I wanted to go through every putrid minute. It fed the resolve to follow through with my retaliation plan. I found bits of mail in that disgusting mix, clues about the households it came from, letters addressed to other addresses, receipts from the local diner, even a few soggy credit card statements. It confirmed what I already suspected. The trash wasn't random. It came from around the entire neighborhood, consolidated just for me. At the bottom of the last bag, I found an envelope labeled with Oakbridge's official stationery. Inside was a typed note. Lawn violations may be subject to further action. No signature, just the official HOA letterhead. A final jab in the guts, as if dumping literal trash on me wasn't enough. I swung by the local hardware store later that evening and purchased extra heavy-duty garbage bags, a new shovel, and, most telling, a set of those huge rubber boots typically used for wading through muddy fields. My mind was fixed on finding a convenient manure source. I recalled a friend who owned a small stable. He had one aging horse, plus a few goats. Every few months, he had to find a way to dispose of the massive amounts of manure that piled up. It dawned on me that not only would I help him out, but I'd also find my perfect gift for the HOA. That friend was Randy. We'd known each other since junior high. Randy was a man of practicality with a wicked sense of humor, and I had no doubt that if I told him the story, he'd jump on board. My biggest concern was how I could possibly transport a truckload of manure without reeking up my own vehicle beyond repair. A pickup truck rental was an option, but I was worried the smell would cling and result in extra cleaning charges. Then it hit me. There was a local hauler who specialized in yard waste disposal. I could pay him to deliver fertilizer. If I slipped him an extra tip, I'd bet he wouldn't ask too many questions about the final destination. But before I fully committed, I decided to give the HOA one last chance to rectify the situation. I filed a formal complaint, per their instructions, including photos of the trash pile. In the letter, I stated that I had reason to believe the HOA had singled me out for an unjust, targeted dumping, and that I wanted the board to provide a written apology and reimbursement for lawn cleaning services. I even used my lab's letterhead to add some extra gravitas. I slid the letter under the HOA office door and also emailed a scanned copy to their official contact address. A week passed. Nothing. During that time, I kept my yard spotlessly maintained, if only to remove any plausible reason they'd have to retaliate again. I even mowed the grass daily and trimmed the edges meticulously. My neighbors gaped at my sudden transformation. But it was purely strategic, a facade to lull the HOA into complacency. I was still fuming, though I tempered it with logical steps. I made a plan, consulted with Randy, and lined up the hauler service. "You're really going to do this?" Randy asked over the phone. I could hear the grin in his voice. "A whole truckload of manure. At least one truckload. Maybe more," I said, pacing my living room. I'd rolled up my living room rug because I half expected to track in some filth during the big day. I didn't want that stink to linger. Randy let out a low whistle. "Just be careful. If you go too far, they might call the cops. Is that worth risking?" "Trust me," I replied. "I've weighed the risk. They dumped literal garbage on my property. Even if they call the police, it'll be a civil dispute. I don't plan on harming anyone, just delivering fertilizer." He burst into laughter. "Man, you got a serious vendetta. Fine, I'll help you bag the manure. You'll pay for the cold beer after, yeah?" "Deal." Meanwhile, Jules expressed misgivings. "Couldn't you just talk to a lawyer?" she asked. "Won't this escalate things?" An attorney would love to take my money, I said, but I'm not fighting them over a sidewalk crack. This is psychological warfare. I want them to see that I won't be trifled with. They aimed for humiliation, so let's see how they handle it in return. Despite Jules's concern, she knew me well enough not to press the issue. She'd witnessed the sheer stress that the HOA had inflicted on me over the years, though I tried not to bring it up too often. The petty fines, the threatening letters, the sly remarks from the board members at the annual gatherings, they'd all added up. This was more than vengeance for one incident. It was a stand against an unjust system in my own backyard. Still no word from the HOA. My patience had run its course. The next day, I dialed the yard hauler, introduced myself, and asked if he'd be interested in picking up a few truckloads of horse manure from my friend's small ranch and dropping them off at a specified address. For an extra $200 tip, he agreed without hesitation. I gave him the general time frame and told him I'd give final confirmation once I got the all-clear from Randy. Everything was falling into place. With each passing day, my chest felt lighter, like the sweet anticipation of a long-awaited comeuppance. Deep down, I knew this act might usher in new problems, but I kept telling myself, I've already lost my sense of security in this neighborhood. At least I can go out swinging. Randy and I spent the following Saturday morning loading manure into massive plastic bins and heavy-duty bags out at his stable. The flies buzzed in excited circles, and the smell was exactly as hideous as you'd imagine. We both wore old clothes and kept mouth and nose covered with bandanas, but there was no hiding from the stench once you got used to the thickness of the hot summer air. If anything, the reek fueled my determination. "You're sure about the quantity?" Randy asked, mopping sweat from his brow. We had already filled 3 of the largest trash bins, plus a dozen thick contractor bags. The pile we were working from was barely dented. Randy's horse, Willow, produced more waste than I ever dreamed possible for a single animal. "I'll take as much as I can afford to deliver," I said, tying off a bag. "I figure single truckload, plus a few side containers. I want the board's entire front walkway covered. They made a spectacle of me. I'll repay the favor." Randy loaded another shovel's worth into the bins. "You'd better film their reaction. This is gold." We joked about attaching a camera to the side of the hauler's truck, but decided we'd be satisfied with seeing it in person. I planned to follow behind in my car, wearing gloves and with the windows rolled up tight to avoid the stench. Randy volunteered to come too, if only for moral support. Jules decided to stay out of it. "I love you," she said, "but I'm not stepping within 50 feet of that fiasco." By mid-afternoon, we had all the containers sealed. Randy would store them until the big day, Sunday night, when the HOA offices, set in an old converted ranch house near the entrance to Oak Bridge, were guaranteed to be empty. According to their posted schedule, the board members dropped by on Mondays and Thursdays. So Sunday was perfect, no prying eyes. Or at least, not many. I suspected a few neighbors might notice, but I hoped my stealth approach would minimize the blowback. And honestly, I half welcomed the idea of them seeing me. Let them find out just how far I was willing to go. That night, I texted the yard hauler to confirm. He replied that he'd come with his truck around 11 p.m. because the roads would be quiet. I can still remember the flutter in my stomach when I saw his confirmation. It was the same kind of thrill you get right before a big roller coaster drop. A part of me realized how insane this was. But that part was overshadowed by the memory of that reeking trash pile on my lawn and the months, no years, of snide intimidation from the HOA. Sunday evening arrived with a humid twilight. I carefully parked 2 blocks away from the HOA office, near the tennis courts, so no one would identify my car's plates. I slipped a baseball cap over my hair and zipped up a light jacket, less suspicious than a hoodie. Randy and I walked in the shadows, meeting the hauler at the stable, loading up the bins and bags. By 11:15, we were on the move. The truck rumbled through the neighborhood, headlights off until we were a few houses away from the target destination. The HOA office sits at the end of a quaint cul-de-sac, ironically named Harmony Way. There's a short walkway leading to a small porch and double doors. The yard is an immaculate patch of grass with a modest flower bed. We pulled onto the curb, adrenaline surging through my veins. The hauler hopped out, and with Randy's help, They began hefting bin after bin, bag after bag of horse manure right onto the porch. The first plop made me tense, like a burglar hearing a sudden noise in a dark house. But soon we found a rhythm. Lift, dump, move. The stuff spread across the walkway in great stinking clumps. Flies zoomed in from the night air, forming a low, buzzing cloud. We moved fast, maybe 15 minutes total. By the time we finished, I swear the entire front stoop was transformed into a stinking dune. Brown lumps towered at least 2 feet high in front of the doors. I stepped back to admire the result. My heart was hammering. I could feel sweat pouring down my back. The smell was so overpowering, I had to pull my jacket over my nose, but I forced a triumphant grin. If the HOA had wanted to wage a war of disgust, well, I had just won the first major battle. We cap it off by propping a small sign on top of the pile, reading, "Return to sender." Then we hopped back into our vehicles. The hauler drove off without a word. Clearly he'd seen enough. Randy chuckled the entire ride home. I just gripped the steering wheel, half in disbelief that I'd actually done it, half gleeful at the vision of Len Tupper's face when he arrived Monday morning. We parted ways, and I slunk back into my house around midnight, stripping off my clothes in the laundry room and tossing them directly into the washing machine. A shower never felt so good. Washing away the physical residue of the act was refreshing, but the mental high lasted well into the night. The entire weekend, I'd worried about the possible repercussions, but in that moment, all I could think was, I did it, and it was perfect. Little did I know that come Monday morning, the real show was about to begin. Sure enough, Monday morning came with a flurry of urgent text messages and phone calls. Word had traveled fast about the steaming mountain of manure on the HOA office porch. One neighbor forwarded me a group email from Len Tupper himself. It read something like, "All residents, we regret to inform you that an act of vandalism took place at the HOA offices. The board is investigating this blatant violation of community standards, and we are confident that local authorities will assist in finding the responsible party. Please remain vigilant and report any suspicious behavior." Local authorities? The police station in our small town rarely deals with anything more dramatic than a traffic stop. An officer or two might come out to make a quick report, maybe scratch their heads at the bizarre scene, but I doubted they'd launch a full-scale investigation. I peeked out my window every time I heard a car engine, worried the cops might show up with sirens blazing. But the day passed without incident. My neighbor across the street, Denise, strolled over during the afternoon. She glanced around as if worried someone might see her, then knocked on my door. I answered cautiously, but she greeted me with a conspiratorial grin. "Hey, so, did you hear about the manure prank?" she asked, trying to hide her excitement. "People are buzzing about it. I've never seen Len so furious." I shrugged, feigning confusion. I heard something happened, but can't say I know details. I tried to keep my voice steady, but the corner of my mouth twitched, threatening to betray me with a smirk. Denise nodded. "My guess is some kid got fed up with the board's antics and decided to show them who's boss. A bunch of us think it's hilarious. Len's been running around claiming it was an orchestrated attack on his authority." "Oh, well, can't blame him for being upset, I suppose," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. "Any idea who might have done it?" she asked, an unmistakable glint of mischief in her eyes. If she suspected me, she was polite enough not to say it outright. "Haven't a clue," I replied, glancing at my watch. "Sorry, Denise, I gotta hop on a work call." As soon as I shut the door, I let out a deep breath. It struck me how easily people believed it could have been a teenager or a new neighbor. Oakbridge was full of folks who quietly resented the HOA, just not enough to risk getting on their bad side openly. A daring prank like this couldn't have come from one of them, right? The next few days were a blur of speculation. My phone blew up with messages from friends, some jokingly accusing me, others praising the unknown culprit. Apparently, the manure was such a large quantity that the city sanitation department had to be called in to remove it, and the job took hours. The odor lingered, and I guess people walking by the office had to pinch their noses. A couple of the more dramatic neighbors insisted on wearing masks just to get their mail. Then, Wednesday evening, I received an official letter from the HOA, delivered by certified mail. My palms began to sweat as I opened it, dreading that they'd somehow discovered the truth. But instead, the letter read, "Dear homeowner, the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association regrets any inconvenience caused by recent disruptions in the community. We are issuing a reminder that unauthorized gatherings, vandalism, or acts of aggression toward HOA property will not be tolerated. We are monitoring the area closely and will be stepping up enforcement of all community regulations. We ask for your patience and cooperation as we handle these matters. Respectfully, the Oak Ridge HOA Board." No direct accusation. Nothing referencing trash on my lawn. Just a vague step-up enforcement. That likely meant more inspections, more fines for petty infractions, a heavier clampdown. In other words, the HOA was doubling down in typical authoritarian style. They were scared, probably worried if they pushed too many neighbors too far, the neighborhood might rise up with more manure mountains or other creative rebellions. I should have felt triumphant, and I did partly, but an uneasy feeling crept into the back of my mind. Maybe they'd retaliate with something truly vicious. At least, that was Jules's concern when she called me that night. "They might be biding their time," she said softly. "Sometimes power-hungry people get nastier when they feel cornered." I exhaled, pacing my living room. "We'll see what they can try. If they put more trash on my lawn, I'll call the health department. If they fine me for nothing, I'll dispute it in municipal court. I'm done letting them walk over me." She paused. "I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself, but just be careful. There's a difference between petty retaliation and an all-out feud. You don't want to get sued or worse." I promised her I'd keep my eyes open. But part of me was itching to see how the HOA would respond to a direct, humiliating blow to their self-importance. My little stunt had changed the power dynamic, at least for the moment. And if I was honest, a tiny part of me, usually buried under my polite exterior, actually hoped they'd try something else. Because I still had a few more tricks up my sleeve if it came to that. But the most immediate aftermath was surprisingly calm. The HOA evidently spent the next 2 weeks dealing with the manure fiasco and the negative buzz around it. They repaired their porch, brought in landscapers to resod the front, and eventually replaced the entire walkway. The cost must have been tremendous, but I noticed that they did not mention a special assessment or any added fees to the community. Maybe they were embarrassed to let residents know how expensive it was. Or maybe Lynn's personal pride forced him to foot the bill quietly. Whatever the reason, I watched from my kitchen window, sipping coffee, as a cleanup crew arrived in broad daylight to cart away the last remnants. The men wore thick gloves and complained loudly about the stench. I couldn't help smiling. Score one for the working-class homeowner tired of being treated like a naughty child in his own home. That, however, was only round one. It remained to be seen if the HOA would escalate, or if the stink of my retaliation would linger long enough to make them think twice. Over the next month, I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once. Even Randy, usually the most carefree guy around, asked if I'd noticed any cars parked suspiciously on our street. "I swear I saw that silver sedan circling the block twice," he remarked one afternoon. "You think the HOA hired a private investigator?" "Possible," I murmured, half joking. But that'd be a new low, even for them. Then we found out from Denise that the HOA had called an emergency compliance review of several properties, including mine. I was supposed to receive notice of an inspection, but it never arrived. Instead, one Friday afternoon, I spotted a man wearing a polo with the HOA logo scanning my property with a camera. He kept snapping pictures of my front bushes, my gutters, and even the side of my house. When I stepped onto the porch to question him, he claimed to be taking photos for routine archival purposes. I wasn't buying it, but I politely asked him to leave. That's when he served me with a piece of paper. "This is your official notice," he said. Then, almost in a whisper, he added, "Next time, you might want to avoid hosting unauthorized waste on HOA property." He gave me a cryptic wink and walked off. I stood there baffled. When I read the notice, I realized they were citing me for unapproved modifications to landscaping and failure to adhere to standard yard maintenance. A potential fine of $500 if not corrected within 14 days. I was furious and flustered, but not entirely surprised. This was their counterpunch. They knew they couldn't prove I'd orchestrated the manure stunt, so they tried to bury me under technicalities. A brand new rule about the shape of hedges or the color of yard mulch, or maybe the presence of untrimmed ground cover. It was exactly the kind of bureaucratic nonsense the HOA excelled at. I called Jules to vent. They're hitting me with bogus fines. We both know it's payback. She sighed. Why not take photos, gather evidence that your lawn is up to standard, and appeal? Doesn't your HOA have an appeal process? They do. But guess who runs the appeal panel? The same board members, led by Tupper. It's a sham hearing. That's when she suggested a different tactic. Could you gather community support to vote him out? Isn't that how HOAs are supposed to work? By majority vote. I hesitated. Yeah, but people in this neighborhood are apathetic, or they're scared. They think if they speak up, they'll face more fines. At best, we might gather a small group who hates Lynn, but the older folks who trust the HOA for property management might not want to rock the boat. Well, she said gently, maybe it's worth trying. Rally the neighbors. Fight them with their own rules. After we hung up, I sat down at the kitchen table, a swirl of emotions in my chest. My anger said, double down and keep retaliating. But my common sense told me it was time to either leave Oakbridge or force a change from within. I recalled the day of the trash fiasco, how powerless I'd felt. The manure fiasco was cathartic, but it wouldn't solve the root issue. That night, I called Denise and asked her if there was a chance the community might support removing Tupper and his crony from the board. She was enthusiastic. Apparently, after the manure incident, many folks had realized how petty and punishing the HOA could be. Once I pitched the idea of organizing a special meeting to discuss a vote of no confidence, she said, count me in. Word spread quietly but quickly among neighbors who had their own run-ins with Tupper's brand of tyranny. I learned about families who've been fined for planting unauthorized flowers, single parents chastised for leaving a stroller on the porch, veterans who got in trouble for having an American flag that was too large. The stories formed a picture of an HOA that thrived on intimidation and fees. The manure stunt had emboldened a wave of discontent. The official Oakbridge bylaws stated that with a petition signed by at least 20% of homeowners, we could call a special election to oust board members. Denise and I hit the sidewalks, going door to door. Many people turned us away at first, afraid to be seen. But once we explained that we had a plan to remove Tupper altogether, the tide shifted. Within a week, we had enough signatures, plus extras. We submitted the petition to the HOA offices. Tupper tried to stall, claiming we'd used invalid forms. But we had the bylaws in hand, thanks to a thoughtful retiree who once served on the board decades ago. So Tupper had no choice but to schedule the election. The special meeting was set for a Wednesday evening at the local library's auditorium. Usually, these HOA gatherings drew maybe a dozen folks. This time, the room was packed, easily over 100 residents. Tupper sat stiffly at the front, flanked by two of his cronies who had voted in every new rule with him. I took a seat in the back, heart hammering, half expecting someone to point at me and yell, "Manure dumper!" But that never happened. Instead, people told their stories, how they felt harassed, how the board refused to listen to reason, how Tupper's petty rulings created an environment of fear. Finally, the vote was called. Hands shot up. When the count concluded, Tupper was out, along with the other two troublemakers. The audience broke into applause, quietly at first, then louder as the realization spread. For the first time, Oakbridge might actually become a community that listened to its residents. After the meeting, Tupper stormed out without a word, his face red with anger. Some folks eyed me knowingly, as if suspecting I'd had a role in toppling him. Denise gave me a thumbs up from across the room. Later, as I walked to my car under the starry sky, I felt a surge of relief. Maybe I'd stooped to a filthy, juvenile trick to spark this change, but in a twisted way, it had worked. The nonsense that Tupper inflicted had mobilized people who were otherwise silent. Our victory felt undeniably sweet. I never did confess openly to orchestrating the manure delivery. But whenever I see the new board members, moderate, more neighborly folks, I can't help noticing how they treat the residents with cautious respect. It's as if a lingering memory of that pungent mountain of fertilizer reminds them. If they push us too far, we might just push or dump right back. In the end, I learned something about communities and power. If bullies set the rules, sometimes you have to get creative to call them out. And sure, maybe my brand of creative was a bit extreme. But hey, after the HOA dumped trash on my lawn, they deserved one whiff of the retribution I had in store. Since that day, my lawn has remained blissfully garbage-free, and the Oakbridge neighborhood is finally on its way to being what it should have been all along, a place we can all call home without fear of petty tyrants. The end.